Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 211, and this time I'm going to talk about Ray Barretto's fantastic album from 1969, Together, which is on Fania Records, and what I have here is a 1972 reissue. Fania, of course, is a legendary label which was known as effectively the Latin Motown. So Ray Barretto, El Rey de las Manos Duras, is a legend of Latin music. He's probably the most famous conga player ever, and this record is recorded pretty much at the height of his fame in 1969. Over his career, he won a Grammy, he was given the Jazz Master Award by the National Endowment for the Arts, and he's influenced countless musicians both in the jazz and Latin genres. This is a brilliant record start to finish and a lot less commercial than some of his 60s work. So Ray Barretto was born in April 1929 in New York City to Puerto Rican parents. His dad leaves the family when Ray is only 4 years old. His mom moves the family to the Bronx, and she's basically his main musical influence, and she's a huge fan of Ellington and Basie, so the whole house is full of jazz as he's growing up. He was too young to fight in World War II, but he did join the army in 1946 when he was 17. He was shipped off to Germany, and it was there, on his off hours, that he was first exposed to Afro-Cuban jazz and particularly to Dizzy Gillespie's Manteca, and there he knew right away, okay, this is the kind of music I want to do when I get home. He's a conga player, and when he gets back to New York in 1949, he immediately starts to hit the jam circuit and quickly establishes a reputation. Dizzy, as I mentioned, by this point had popularized Afro-Cuban jazz, and so Ray's conga skills were actually quite in demand. Charlie Parker heard him and had him come play for him, and he played for a bunch of other relatively well-known players before landing with Tito Puente, and he stayed with Tito for 4 years. The period of time he spent with Puente, which included his first recordings, gives him a lot of exposure, and he ends up being quite influential, crossing genres over into the jazz world. And in this period between, say, 58 to 62, he does all kinds of crossover work. He ends up basically being the in-house conga player for Prestige, for Blue Note, and for Riverside Jazz Records. However, Latin music remained his true calling, as it did throughout his career, and maybe as this is the first Latin record I've actually reviewed in this channel, it's time to just take a little bit of a sidebar to talk about Latin music, and in particular, the central influence of Cuban music in Latin music. And to understand all this, you have to know a little bit about the economic history of Cuba, which is basically that of a very large sugar plantation. The Spanish had basically wiped out the indigenous population. They brought slaves over from West Africa, and the combination of the music that the West African slaves brought with them, along with the Spanish instrumentation and traditions which the Spanish-Cuban population had, creates this blend that's not really equaled anywhere else. I guess you could argue it kind of is in Brazil in different ways, in a very different tradition, but in the Spanish-speaking countries of Latin America, it has no equal, and it's intoxicating, and people love it. And so by the middle part of the 20th century, the big orchestras in Cuba, like famously La Sonora Matancera, which is probably the best-known orchestra, are basically playing the same cultural role in Latin American society that the Basie and Ellington and Goodman orchestras are playing in Europe and the US. Cuba in the 40s and 50s, of course, became a destination for Americans who increasingly had more spending power than anybody else. It also became a bit of a destination for organized crime, and so Havana becomes this absolute hub. Basically, it was Vegas before Vegas, and in fact, Vegas owes its very existence to the fact that Havana was effectively shut down by the Cuban Revolution. Since Castro came to power in 1959, interpretations of the Batista era tend to divide between people who are critics of the excesses of capitalism and of the exploitation and crime and racism of the time, and craven apologists for those kinds of things. But no matter which side of that debate you're on, we can all probably agree that most of the Latin music styles and some of the dance crazes like the cha-cha and the rumba and so on, all of this stuff that spreads all over the Western Hemisphere in particular, emanates from Cuba. The other part of this incredible cultural influence is that anything which happens in Cuba which affects Cuban music has ripples all the way through the Americas, including, of course, the Cuban Revolution. The new regime sought to have people lead a different kind of life. They promoted different kinds of music, which were much more simple and folk-based. The money for big-time entertainment dried up, and a lot of the whole scene basically relocates to the United States, including some of the big orchestras and some of the greatest singers, like people like Celia Cruz. A lot of these people migrated to New York, which they knew was the musical capital of the United States, and so by the early 1960s, New York is the center of Latin music in America. This, of course, is where Ray Barretto lives and plays, and he's been making a living with Tito Puente, he's been doing these sidemen gigs on these jazz records, but now the Latin music scene is just exploding right there locally in New York. In 1962, Ray decides to form his own group, Charanga La Moderna, and they have their first hit, El Watusi, or the Watusi, which of course was a big dance hit and sold him a lot of records, typecast him a bit, which he wasn't that happy with, but made him a wealthy man. The next big Latin music craze, which happens in the mid-1960s, is Boogaloo, which is basically a blend of Latin and R&B, and Ray rides the back of this with several records, first of all for United Artists, but then eventually he moves to Fania Records, which, as I mentioned, is this legendary Latin label just starting out at the time. His first recording for them was the album Acid, which is one of the great Boogaloo records and established him as a big star not only of the label but also of Latin music in general. That was in 1968, and in 1969 he goes into the studio to make Together. This record is made sometime in 1969 and somewhere in New York. I don't know exactly when, I don't know what studio. The internet is holding its cards very close to his chest. But I can tell you something about the producer, who was a guy called Jerry Masucci, who also happened to be the co-founder of Fania Records. In the early 1950s, as a young man, he joins the NYPD while he's going to law school. He then goes down to Cuba before the revolution, gets a job with a PR firm. Anyway, eventually, Americans can't stay in Cuba. He comes back and he sets himself up as a divorce attorney in New York. Young guy comes in called Johnny Pacheco, who is a Dominican musician who has had a number of pachanga hits, but feels he's really getting ripped off by his label. And the two get to talking and they decide, well, we're going to start our own label. And they decide to name it Fania. Fania was a cafe in Havana, which was highly popular with musicians prior to the revolution. They start off selling records out of the back of a car in Spanish Harlem. Things take off. And as I mentioned, ultimately these guys become effectively the Motown of Latin music in New York. Their catalog hasn't been curated that well retrospectively, although that's actually changing, and you can start to get some really good remasters and reissues of their stuff. But basically, this label is single-handedly responsible for the emergence of salsa, because what they were doing was capitalizing on the fact that you couldn't really get music from Cuba in the US, but you could record music that was basically Cuban music, and they sped it up a little bit, very dance floor friendly. They did a great job of assembling all kinds of different artists, people like Ruben Blades and other people, and basically monopolized the best Latin talent in the world in the early part of the 1970s. Back to the musicians on the record, of course, it's Ray Barretto, the leader, on congas, and he also sings in the title track. The rest of the vocals are handled by Adalberto Santiago, which was typical of Ray's band at the time. Trumpets are handled by Papi Roman and by Roberto Rodriguez. The piano is by Louis Cruz. The bass is handled by Andy Gonzalez. The bongos are handled by Tony Fuentes. And the timbales are played by Orestes Velato. Side one starts with the title track, Together, which is a righteous piece of Latin funk fusion. As I mentioned, Barretto sings, not Santiago. There were a lot of calls in the late 60s and early 70s for people to get it together, and this is one of the better ones, I have to say. It's driven by Louis Cruz's awesome piano riff, and it might be more passionate than it is musically excellent, but the whole thing just works somehow. Next track is Adivinami y Olvidate, which is more of a traditional guaguanco, or maybe, I guess you could call it salsa. It's our first introduction to Santiago's voice, which is excellent and powerful and carries the whole rest of the record. The next track, Hipocresía y Falsidad, or Hypocrisy and Lies, probably the best track on the record. It has these really cool changes during the verses, which you just don't expect, but really work. Given the subject matter, as you might expect, there's a kind of a menacing feel to the song as well. But then the best part is this piano riff, which kicks in about halfway through, which is, I don't know, basically why we buy records. No Olvido a Caracas, I Won't Forget Caracas, is basically a rip-roaring percussion fest. And the last track on side one, De Donde Vengo, or Where I Come From, has this just delicious piano riff again by Cruz. The trumpet work is excellent. This whole thing just settles into this hypnotic groove early on, and it's just best to go with it. Side two starts with Vive y Vacila, or Live and Hesitate, which I think, again, is a guaguanco, and it's a great song. It's basically about, live life to the full, but don't be an idiot, which I guess is life advice we can get behind. Invitación al Son is basically about the sweet sounds of the band, one of those great bragging songs for all the chicks to enjoy, liberally interpreting the lyrics. The last song, Tintindeo, is built around this rapid bass riff, which builds anticipation. Ray doesn't actually come in until about the 2-minute mark. When he does, first of all, it's under some piano work by Louis Cruz, but then when he does take center stage eventually, it's to great effect. This is a record from the period when Ray Barretto could really do no wrong. It gets a little bit overshadowed, actually, in discussions of his catalog, compared to Acid, which comes just before it, or his later album Indestructible, which got a lot of attention, or his work with the Fania All-Stars at the time, which was great. But this is a real gem. The singing and playing is uniformly excellent. The percussion is epic. It's a great introduction into the totally vibrant Latin music scene of the late 60s and early 70s, and of course into Ray Barretto's catalog. For me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.